From the New Arts and Media Studios in Milwaukee, I'm Charles Purcell. This is The Log. Well, here we are, the anniversary, 1 year now since the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Thinking about that day and thinking about what you and I talked about, boy, was I wrong. The day of, I didn't really realize, it happened on a Wednesday. It took me a couple of days to actually realize what had happened. We talked about how long this took to sink in. Because the initial news coverage was nothing compared to the cell phone footage we saw. I remember that came out maybe not so much the Thursday. I think it was the Friday after I saw the first real footage from inside. And then over the weekend, I saw a lot of that. And I came back and you and I talked again on Monday, and I had to apologize. I had no idea. So, yeah, I kind of blew it. And even in the days approaching, in the run-up, there was nobody more guilty than me for the so-called lack of imagination, which is a phrase we heard over and over. I never even dreamed that they would do what they did. And in hindsight, I should have. I was an idiot. We all were, especially the people in charge of security, Homeland Security, Capitol Police, FBI, all of them, D.C. Police, National Guard, the Pentagon. All of those folks absolutely should have known. I'll kick myself up and down the block for having that lack of imagination. But there is no excuse for those folks. What I thought at the time was that they were going to show up in big numbers, which we knew. I mean, we knew from the night before. They showed up the day before and had rallies that night and were out looking for trouble. So they were going to be out in big numbers. As far as any violence, up until that point, the month prior, it was at November or December, I think there were a couple different events where Proud Boys and Boogaloo and Three Percenters and all the, that whole crowd, all the militia types, had their rallies along with the more garden variety Trumpsters. So I think there was one in November, one in December. Of course, we got Charlottesville prior to that. And the violence is always between protesters and counter-protesters. So here's another case where, man, was I wrong. Well, I'll give myself a little bit of a break. I was questioning the mayor of D.C., Muriel Bowser, when she said, counter-protesters, please stay home. And at the time, I was conflicted about that. Of course, she turned out to be absolutely right, 100%. Because up until that point, there have been so many cases where the deplorables and the militia types and the neo-Nazis would show up for some event or protest or march, and they would be completely outnumbered and embarrassed by the counter-protesters yelling, "Nazis, go home." And that's a great sight. And I guess I hoped that was still possible. Well, okay, right-thinking, decent people, not just Black Lives Matter, not just Antifa, but everybody, a whole coalition of good, decent Americans. Why don't you just show up and outnumber them and just embarrass them? Make them look foolish. That was my great dream. And with 2020 hindsight, I could see how ridiculous that was. So, Mayor Bowser absolutely made the right call. Counter-protesters, stay home. Everybody just stay home. And with recent reporting, that is shown to be even more important. Because, take the actual Capitol attack off the table for the moment. All right, let's cut us all some slack. Think, well, I don't blame you for having that lack of imagination. But it's easy to imagine is violence between protesters and counter-protesters. And if enough people had shown up as counter-protesters, that could have been a really wicked, violent scene, just outside the Capitol, again, without the Capitol attack even happening. And recent reporting is showing, because we're getting news every single day I'm sorry I can't cite my source on this one. I'll have to look it up and maybe I'll follow up with you. But that was allegedly, and I think quite reasonable to assume, the actual plan of the Orange Menace. He was counting on counter-protesters to show up. And then there'd be such a melee that he could declare martial law. Remember, the pillow guy was seen going in and out of the Oval Office. A photographer got a nice zoomed-in shot of his papers with that very headline about martial law. The president can just declare an emergency and stop everything. Anyway, so yeah, just thinking back a year ago, I was very wrong to recommend or even to entertain the idea that, yeah, counter-protesters, go out and just outnumber them. That would have been a disaster. Well, I knew this much. There was no doubt that January 6th was going to go down as a date that everyone will remember. It was June 7th, 1941, September 11th, 2001, and January 6th, 2021. And that's certainly the case. Okay, so now we're a year out. What are you following? What are you looking for? What are you hoping for? I was disappointed when the January 6th Congressional Select Committee was all we had. Of course, the Republicans were able to put the kibosh on any sort of serious commission, which this deserved and still does. But they needed Congress to pass that, and Republicans didn't. They had the power with the filibuster, so that didn't happen. So the January 6th committee was all we had, and I was pretty disappointed. I have to say, and what we've been able to learn, and they're being pretty open. They're coming out on the cable shows and the Sunday shows, and they're giving interviews to the New York Times and the Washington Post, Adam Schiff and Chairman Benny Thompson and co-chair or vice chair, whatever her title is, Liz Cheney. They're out there. They're talking to us. They're letting us know what they're doing. They're releasing reports that, when they subpoena somebody, we know about it. Over 300 interviews, thousands of documents. I mean, it appears they're doing a good job. And I've said all along that, they don't have to make headline news every day. They just have to put their head down and work. Over time, I've changed my mind about that. And I'm thinking, it's really time. The time has come to present this to the American people. I know you're still working. I know your work isn't done. But I think it's time to get loud about it. So I'm pleased when I see them out giving interviews and when they put out releases on what they're doing. And just as I'm having these thoughts, now I'm hearing from Adam Schiff and from others who've talked about it. I think Schiff was asked about it over the weekend on one of the Sunday shows. Are you going to go public? Yeah. He didn't have a timetable for us. A few weeks, maybe a couple of months. God, the clock moves slow in D.C., doesn't it? It's just horribly frustrating. But there you go. I think it's important that we get that sort of Watergate hearing moment. Of course, old enough to remember that. And anybody who knows anything about history knows how important those public hearings were. And and if we can get some really good quality public hearings that can grip the nation, that's an important component at this point. Who's going to be the John Dean of this story? The part that makes this a little bit, brings out my pessimism. This is our fourth bite at the apple, if you think about it, right? And we had the Mueller report, and then that's finally released, and then it takes another how many months to get Mueller to testify before Congress, and we got to see him in person. And it was all quite disappointing. But he had those 10 items. He basically wrote 10 articles of impeachment for Congress. They didn't follow up. They didn't impeach the guy. They had 100 reasons to impeach him, and Mueller spelled it out. He basically gave them 10 articles in his report, and Congress didn't have the guts to do it. And then when they did it over Ukraine, and of course it was an open and shut case. He clearly violated his oath of office over and over again, blatantly. So there's number 2. And then number 3, after the insurrection, well, of course they have to impeach him again, so his second impeachment. And once again, if that first impeachment wasn't heinous enough, the second impeachment, how the entire Republican caucus, 50 Republican senators, only 7 vote to convict. Just shameful. So much of the many bad things that have happened over the course of the last 5 years could have been stopped in their tracks at several different points along the way. I've been frustrated with all the attention on the actual rioters themselves. Of course they have to be investigated, charged, tried, and convicted. Of course. But my frustration has been, well, number one, and here's something else that doesn't require hindsight. I was yelling at my television on that Wednesday. It was when it was dying down, when it was finally coming to a close, and the insurrectionists were all filing out. And the Capitol Police were standing at the door like flight attendants. Okay, bye-bye now, bye-bye, bye-bye. That I didn't understand, right from the get-go. I don't know why they didn't just seal the building. And when they did send them out of the building, they should have sent them right into waiting buses where every single damn one of them would have been processed on the spot. Just surround the Capitol with 100 buses and lock them up on the bus. Get their name, get their vitals, get their picture, get their mugshot, get their prints. I don't know why that didn't happen. The fact that the FBI and Department of Justice have had to spend the last year doing all this investigation and finding people and getting tips and proving who was where and matching faces with photos and videos. I don't know how they didn't put them all on a damn fleet of buses right on that day. I'll never understand that. It would have cut their investigation in half, which is massive. I'll give them credit, you know. It's a big, huge deal. I guess it's the largest investigation in the history of the Department of Justice, in the history of the FBI. It's the largest. But there's been no indication, no public statements up until just yesterday when we finally heard from Merrick Garland. And he was very, well, I guess we should maybe spend a little time on that. But generally speaking, it looks like from the sidelines here, we've had a couple of dozen books written on the subject. We've had investigative reporters all over the place, documentaries, podcasts. I mean, there's been so much investigative work, including the January 6th committee. Where is the Justice Department in all this? Are they actively doing anything? Because all we hear about are the yahoos who climb the wall and the shaman with his furry hat. And we hear about these people. And yeah, like I said, they've got to be dealt with. But is the FBI, is the Department of Justice actually doing anything regarding the Orange Menace, the dozen or more Republican members of Congress who seem to be in on this, advisors, the inner circle? We got this whole sort of mafia family with all these odd characters. You know, the pillow guy walking into the Oval Office with martial law written into his notes. The lawyers with their plans to usurp the certification of the rightfully elected president. The strategies that continue to this day in various state legislatures to fix what they saw was broken. In other words, the Orange Menace couldn't steal Georgia because it was against the law. Okay, well, change the law. So they changed the law in Georgia, and they're attempting it in other states. So all this is going on. Where's DOJ? Because really, they're the only ones. They're the only ones with power to actually put the hammer down here. So we finally hear from Merrick Garland. He's been dead silent for a year. And so he gives this speech this week. The headline that he makes, he says, I'm paraphrasing, those involved must be held accountable regardless of who they are, whatever level. And very importantly, he said whether or not they were present at the incident. If they were responsible for it, they will be held accountable. So that was a direct reference, as direct as he wanted to be, to the people I just mentioned. The members of Congress who aided and abetted and helped plan the inner circle of the Orange Menace and the Orange Menace himself. But Merrick Garland is being very careful in not saying that. So for those of us who have been just dying to hear from him, dying to hear something, well, I guess that was something. He spent most of the speech just sort of explaining and defending and praising the department. I mean, officially, technically, he was addressing the department itself, the men and women of the Department of Justice. But it was a speech for us, for you and me. He was kind of forced to give it. People in Washington have been saying what you and I have been saying. What's going on? And some have been very critical. I've been holding back judgment. I've been trying to just assume the best, but I don't know. I'm still worried. I don't know if the words of this one address are enough to appease me. Because really, so far, it's been just all about the perpetrators, the actual yahoos on the ground and climbing the walls and breaking the windows. But Attorney General Merrick Garland says all will be held accountable. Okay, you said it. Go get them. He said, as long as it takes. Okay, how long is it going to take? I understand it's a big job, but holy cow. He reiterates once more that the same rules apply for everyone, including the most powerful. So a direct reference. Good. Thank you. Appreciate it. You're going to throw us a couple bones. I appreciate it. Part of his speech surprised me just a little bit. He took it beyond the Capitol attack, talked about rising violence and threats of violence in what he called shared public spaces. So election workers and airline flight crews and school personnel and journalists, elected officials from all levels. And he really spent quite a lot of time decrying that and promising that DOJ would do everything they can about that. It was good to hear. Although he did toss in one quote that I hated. He said that all this violence is not related to any particular political point of view. That's just blatantly untrue. That's like the Orange Menace saying about Charlottesville there were very fine people on both sides. Let's be very clear. If there's any left-wing violence, that was over in the 70s. We haven't really had any measurable left-wing violence for decades. And ever since then, it's been growing and growing on the right wing. And what we have now is pure right-wing, Christian, nationalist, white supremacist violence. I mean, that's not debatable. That's not a debate. So the fact that he had to kind of both sides it was very disappointing. I don't know. He's got a job. He's got a very particular job. I'm not better than Merrick Garland. I'm not going to second guess him. These are just my personal frustrations. He also spent a good deal of time talking about voting rights, which made me happy. And he didn't both sides this one. He's very explicit about protecting the rights, especially of Black Americans, and the very history of the Department of Justice, very heavily steeped in protecting voting rights. And he was very critical of SCOTUS's decision, a couple of decisions that whittled away and finally kind of broke the Voting Rights Act. So good for him. Good for him on that. He was also very clear about the big lie, though he didn't use the term. He may as well have. Very clear about unfounded claims of election fraud, shown in virtually every court case where it was brought up. Said that the transition of power must be peaceful. So, he said some very definite things. I spent a little time on this speech because I think it's important. I think it's one that we needed to hear. I think it's one that will be remembered. Well, what else can I say about this anniversary, this commemoration of January 6th? There's a new updated version of the PBS Frontline documentary that I recommend. It's available for streaming right now on the website, PBS website. I think they produced it in April. American Insurrection, I forget the title. The reporter goes back, and most of the documentary is about the militia movement and the violence. And so he goes to Charlottesville, spends quite a lot of time in Michigan, that whole flap when they attacked the Michigan State House and threatened the governor. But he draws a straight line from there to January 6th. But in the updated version, in the final act of this documentary, and this is what's good about the update, spend some time really exploring how this violence has been mainstreamed. And that's an important point. So if you're interested in the subject, or maybe you saw the Frontline documentary back in April, this is a good update with some good new information. And yes, it is pretty disturbing on how the violence and the extremism has been mainstreamed. There's a coalition now. I think I alluded to it a few minutes ago. Yeah, there's a coalition between the garden variety deplorables and the radical extremist right-wing militia types. And then add to that coalition elected officials. And that's what makes this unique. We've had militias, we've had violence, we've had extremism, but never before has there been such a strong coalition between standard Republican voters. We're talking tens of millions of people in this really frightening coalition. It has your standard voter base. It has your extremist right-wing, white nationalist militia, ready for civil war wing, and elected officials that go right to the top, leaders of the party, potential presidential candidates, a former president. And once we get through the midterms, we're going to have more Marjorie Taylor Greenes and more Lauren Boeberts, because we know how the primary system works. We know how gerrymandering works. So we're going to have an entire Republican Party now that has coalesced into a legitimately dangerous, existentially dangerous entity. And I think that's where I want to close it today, because the one important thing that I think needs to be recognized, needs to be acknowledged, is we know who these people are. One of the most important bits of information we've had recently is this report from the University of Chicago, Professor Robert Pape. It's been out on all the news programs. And, talk about investigations taking time. Research takes time. And they've had a year now to look at this. And what they're telling us is the militias were only a small part, 10% maybe. Now, they were at the front of the line of this insurrection. They were the ones tossing aside the bike racks. They're the ones who broke the first window and breached the Capitol. So yeah, they were right at the front of the line. But of this whole group, there were only about 10% of the insurrectionists. It was a wide variety of people from all over the country. A disparate group. Not necessarily a lot in common. Except for two things. They're white and they're Christian. In very, very high numbers. The great proportion of people who attacked the Capitol were white folks who came from places where Biden won. And more importantly, where their particular demographic, their whiteness, was in decline. Of all the characteristics of all the insurrectionists, there's a pretty wide variety, and you can't lump them into one group except for this one. And thank goodness for this report, because I think this has been underreported and over this past year has been forgotten. These were white insurrectionists. The fact that they were white is central to their motivation. And Christian, because that's the other thing that University of Chicago discovered. And so when these people say, which they'll often lean on this thing whenever they're asked, they always say, well, we have to take back our country. Our country is being taken away. Our country is being destroyed. Well, you may have wondered, like I have, what the hell do you mean by that? How is the country being destroyed? I don't understand. Well, what it means is that their power is being taken away. Their white supremacy is being challenged, and they're not having it. Some good reporting I've seen just in the last week about how, now to think about it, it was from the producer or director of the Frontline documentary being interviewed on Democracy Now! He said very explicitly that in their interviews with the militias, the white supremacists, they changed their messaging from racial to political, and they saw their numbers skyrocket. So it's not about we hate black people. It's not about white power. No, they changed their language, and they pushed the other big lie, socialism. Democrats, they're stealing your nation. You won't recognize it. So their motivation hasn't changed at all, but their messaging changed. And when it did, they saw their numbers go through the roof. And that's when this coalition, your standard Republican voter, your more kind of right-wing deplorable, elected officials, and then the militias themselves and the white power, white supremacist groups, they can all coalesce, which they've done. For the first time in history. We've never seen this before. This is new. So in all the reporting, this is the one thing you cannot forget. This is the one thing that must take precedent over all other analysis. This is a Christian nationalist, white supremacist movement. And they are scared shitless that they're losing their position of power. It's the great replacement theory that you've heard so much about. This theory that's been around for years about how the left wing or the Democrats, that's why they're in love with immigrants, because they want more people of color, because they want to basically destroy the white Christian nation and build a brand new nation in its place. That's the great replacement theory. White conservative Christians are under attack. They're trying to steal our country. And this is, after all, our country. We're white, we're Christian, damn it, it's ours. We make the rules. So the funny thing is about this great replacement theory is, in a way, it's true. Because, nobody's coming after you. Nobody's going to persecute you. Nobody's going to hurt you. Nobody's going to put you in jail. But, yeah, you're going to lose some of your power. You're going to be a citizen like everybody else is. You're going to have, one person, one vote. You're just going to be one among many. So in that sense, yeah, it is true. You are going to lose your power. You're going to lose your position of white supremacy, of Christian white supremacy. And that's what this is. That's all this is. Yeah, you can't take the religious aspect and you can't take the race aspect out of this. Everything else is a detail. Because the other thing I didn't mention, the study from the University of Chicago, it's not about the economy. There were doctors and lawyers and carpenters and all sorts of people. Most of these people were doing fine. They owned their own businesses. They had plenty of money. They could afford to fly to D.C. on a Monday or Tuesday and hang out for a couple nights and do the rally on Wednesday and go back for the weekend and tell their friends. So it's not this, oh, we've been left behind. It's the economy, stupid. Get over that. This is all about the replacement theory. This is all about white supremacy and white supremacists trying to hang on. They won't admit it, but that's what it's about. Well, some of them will. If you get a couple drinks in them, maybe they will. Yeah, it's about Christian nationalism. It's about hating LGBTQ folks. So in all the talk you're going to hear about January 6th as we come to the anniversary here. That's what it is. Above all else. This is cis, hetero, white Christian men making their last stand before history and demographics just toss them aside. And they're not having it. All right, let's talk again soon. I love you. I'm Charles Bursell.